In continuation of what we discussed in respect of postmodernism and post-structuralism, let us explore further their relevance or their limitations in international relations. Among the factors we discussed in the last section, power is perhaps the most critical aspect that we need to take up in the context of international relations. Of course, power is an important variable or a factor in international relations, but the way power is understood in international relations traditionally is different from what we see it within the context of postmodernism and post-structuralism. So in that sense, the contributions of post-structuralists or postmodernists, we call them as post-structuralists and postmodernists, like Michel Foucault, Frank Derrida and others, their contributions are very, very significant in understanding how power operates. And power is perhaps one of the a few themes running through much of Michel Foucault's works. The other could be like knowledge, subjectivity, and so on and so forth. Foucault would like to see power as not a stock of capabilities. Rather, he is interested in understanding how power relations and how power mechanisms affect everyday life. And this is different from seeing power as a commodity which can be possessed in a person or in an institution or a structure, or is used for individual or organizational purposes. The range of actors or agencies go from an individual to state and international institutions. And here Foucault says power is not something that is acquired, seized, or shared, something or someone holds on to or allows it to slip away. Instead, Foucault sees it as a relation made visible when it is exercised, employed at all levels and in many dimensions. So studies or studying power involves understanding how power operates, the procedure, the practices and techniques that reveal its effect. So Foucault is maybe if you read his an essay on governmentality, he reflects the view of power intertwined with another concept or another important subject in Foucauldian analysis, knowledge and power. He does not see knowledge as detached or independent of power. Knowledge is essential to the manifestation of sources of power. The procedures for the formulation of or accumulation of power are not neutral instruments for the presentation of the real. So thus power knowledge, you must use it as not a separate concept. Power knowledge, power/knowledge, and this power knowledge linkage implies essentially two things. For one, it challenges the depiction of power and knowledge as separate things, as positivism has been championing. This particular notion, as knowledge and power are separate and two different things, that has been challenged in Foucault. And power and knowledge for him are coterminous. and one does not exist, one cannot exist without the other. The second major implication is that power is productive. It became uh, productive, and it creates objects. In that sense, in Foucault, power is not negative, but it is creative, and that can be engaged in that way. So in Foucault, power is everywhere, diffused, embodied in discourses, knowledge, and all regimes of truth. When you say the regimes of truth, it means that you have several truths. It's not that we have one truth. You have several truths coexisting, and sometimes they constitute themselves into a regime because there are several ways of or several interpretations of the same phenomenon. So power is everywhere. It comes from everywhere. So in this sense, power is neither an agency nor a structure. Instead, it is a sort of meta power or a regime of truth that pervades society and which is in constant flux and which is in constant negotiation. So Foucault uses the term power knowledge to signify that power is constituted through a kind of what we call as an engagement of knowledge, and knowledge is constituted through by an engagement with power. That means it signifies that power is constituted though through accepted forms of knowledge, scientific understanding and truth, like that. So each society has its regime of truth and its general politics of truth. Sometimes some scholars would like to interpret regimes of truth in terms of general politics of truth. That is, the types of discourse which every society accepts and makes as true. So these regimes of truth or general politics of truth are the result of scientific discourse and institutions, and they are reinforced and defined constantly through educational system, media, and the flux of political or economic ideologies, and so on and so forth. So in this sense, the battle for truth is not for some absolute truth. Postmodernism doesn't believe in absolute truth or universal truth, but it can be discovered and accepted. But a battle about the rules according to which true and false are separated and specific effects of power are attached to the true. So in that sense, power is also a major source of social discipline and conformity. It's done through what we call as a kind of a discursive practice. Foucault calls discursive practice as a system of rules governing the products of statements in a particular society at a certain moment in history. So these rules are in fact are not visible. They are anonymous, sometimes unintended. They are essentially rules for the production of statements, determining not merely what can and cannot be said at one moment. Say, for example, to say that someone is mad, it needs that madness exists as a concept, and that the rules of its use are established. So it is the production of these rules that remain important. That's why that we call discursive practice as very important in the production of knowledge. So Foucault points to a new kind of disciplinary power that can be observed in the administrative systems and social services that were created in the 18th century Europe, such as prisons, schools, mental hospitals, and so on and so forth. So they are the system of surveillance and assessment no longer required force or violence as people learn to discipline themselves and behave in expected ways. You might be knowing that Foucault used this Benthamic concept of panopticism in reference to the surveillance surveillance in a jail through a structure from where you can see all prisoners and like that, kind of like when prisoners know that someone is always watching you uh, without any kind of regime of violence, then you learn to discipline yourself and behave in such a manner. So the surveillance state, a panopticon state is exactly what Foucault has been talking about. So Foucault was fascinated by the mechanisms of prison surveillance. What I said is a panopticon strategy, school disciplines, the promotion of norms about bodily conduct, including sex. So he studied psychiatry, he studied medicine, he studied criminology, and their roles as bodies of knowledge that define norms of behavior and deviance. So physical bodies are subjugated and conditioned and made to behave in certain ways as a microcosm of social control of the wider population through what he called as biopower. So disciplining and biopower create a discursive practice. So a major point about Foucault's approach to power is that it transcends politics. It goes beyond politics and sees power as a everyday socialized and embodied phenomenon. So that is what he says. State-centric power struggles, including revolutions, do not always lead to change in the social order. So many criticized Foucault's notion of power as so elusive and so removed from agency and structure that it has no scope for practical actions like that. But his idea of power goes beyond our structural perception or structured perception in that sense, causing us to discipline ourselves without any willful coercion from others and like that. This reminds of Gramscian notion of hegemony, how hegemony is established with the exercise of consent, with the use of consent rather than exercise of force through coercion and like that. So contrary to many interpretations, Foucault believed in possibilities for action and resistance. There was a misconception that Foucault was an armchair intellectual and he was talking about all these things from an intellectual glass house. He has been very active. He has been an active participant of various struggles in different areas of Europe and elsewhere. So he sees discourse as a site of both power and resistance. It's not only of discourse as a kind of a dominant practice, but also a kind of a site of resistance with scope for what we call a subverting or contesting strategies of power. So you find that many IR scholars who derived inspiration from Foucault, Derrida and others, they used their concept of power, their categories of dealing with all these issues like that. So at least 2-3 IR scholars we can identify who can be called as postmodernists or post-structuralists in that way. Like for example, Richard Ashley and R.B.J. Walker. These two names are so prominent since 1980s in the discipline of IR, Richard Ashley and R.B.J. Walker. And they try to explain how knowledge and power or knowledge power are interconnected in the theory and practice of international relations. So the notion of discourse has replaced the conventional distinction between theory and practice. Thereby, um, they problematized the dichotomy between reality and its textual representation. Ashley is more interested uh, in in disciplining deconstruction of power. That became an important question in international relations. Power, knowledge question in IR. How this deconstruction is possible in power, knowledge realm of international relations like that. Walker actually focuses on how sovereignty regulates our sense of time, our sense of history, and our sense of progression like that. Using a Weberian notion of iron cage, Walker says that it limits our understanding and the capacity to imagine the political alternatives. If you read his volume, Inside Outside International Relations as a Political Theory, Walker addresses the question of state sovereignty and boundary making in a different way, unlike the conventional IR scholarship. Walker actually problematizes state sovereignty in the background of binaries: self, other, identity, difference, universality, particularity, unity, diversity, internal, external, inside, outside. These are all binaries that we traditionally consider in international relations. But Walker says that there are gray areas in between. We must go beyond these binaries and find out where the problem of boundary emerges and like that. Richard Ashley, he also uh, exposed an important dimension of this power-knowledge nexus. He highlighted what Foucault calls the rule of eminence between knowledge of the state and the knowledge of man. Knowledge of the state and the knowledge of the man. Ashley would be more comfortable in telling that modern statecraft is modern mancraft. Modern statecraft is modern mancraft. Both Ashley and Walker and many others also were interested in using certain types of categories which Foucault, Derrida, and others used. One example is the concept genealogy. Genealogy in postmodernism, particularly in writings of Walker and Ashley, it registers and exposes the importance of power-knowledge relations. It underlines perspectives which deny the capacity to identify origins and meanings in historical or history objectivity. The genealogical approach is essentially a kind of strategy to deny this, what we call as so-called objectivity in our understanding. It is an anti-essentialist. It is genealogical approach is basically anti-essentialist. Essentialism is something which we know that it underscores that certain traditional concepts, ideals, skills, these are all essential to society and like that. Postmodernism challenges this essentialist notion. So genealogical approach offers the idea that all knowledge is situated in a particular time and space and issues from a particular perspective. So it cannot be universalized, it cannot be objectified in that sense. The subject of knowledge is situated in and conditioned by a political and historical context, and it is constrained to function with the particular concepts and categories of knowledge. So knowledge therefore is not universal or absolute. It is actually constrained by time and space. So there is no truth, only competing truths or competing perspectives. So postmodernism, international postmodernist or post-structural IR scholars say that war, conflict, etc., can be represented in different ways with significantly different effects. No, David Campbell, for example, written on several such things, like for example, his analysis of the Bosnian War. The way the Bosnian War itself has been represented by different scholars in different localities is an example. That means that on questions of war, in conflict, etc., in international relations, you don't have a single perspective. You have different perspectives because of competing interests behind a particular perspective. So in the absence of a universal framework, or in the absence of an overarching perspective, we are left with a plurality of perspectives, multiple perspectives. So we encounter a world of perspectives, a world of interpretations, or in Derrida's terms, only textuality, in the sense that we have many perspectives being included in a particular discourse, but we actually see only one, or a major one, which we see it in a different way because of the presence of a discourse. So the way 9/11 has been interpreted is an example. I think many of these postmodern or post-structural IR scholars used this as an example of 9/11, how it has been represented, whether it is a representation of terrorism or a representation of Islamophobia, and so on and so forth. So textual strategies are very important. This textuality, the question of textuality actually has emerged from the Derridian notion. Interestingly, an IR scholar called Derderian, not Derrida, Derderian, he argues that postmodernism is concerned with exposing the textual interplay behind power politics. So the reality of power politics is always already constituted through textuality and inscribed modes of representation. So textuality is a recurrent theme of postmodernism, derived essentially from the Derridian definition of text, perhaps elaborated in his famous book of Grammatology. So he explains text as a constituted reality emerging from an interpretative experience. Postmodernists underline interpretation as a critical factor, a necessary factor, and it is fundamental to the constitution of the social world. And it is here that the strategies of deconstruction and double reading are frequently deployed by scholars. Double reading or rereading. Through this, any text can be read or reread as saying something quite different from what it appears to be saying, claiming. Rather than agreeing with what a text reveals itself with a spatial meaning, with a particular meaning, deconstruction actually seeks to disclose many meanings in a subversive way. A deconstructive criticism of a text shows that there is nothing except the text. That is what we cannot criticize or evaluate a meaning for a text by reference to anything external to it. And some people may interpret it as a close reading of what we call as a kind of a close reading of a text without the context. Actually, it is not like that. A text in that sense is not without a context. In deconstruction, text is as much contextual. And there is a wrong impression developed by some scholars that Derrida is concerned about only close reading of a text. It's not like that. A reading of a text cannot be complete without its context. Uh, Richard Attlee's double reading of anarchy in international relations is one of the most significant deconstructions in the discipline. He exposes how sovereignty and anarchy are used by IR scholars to generate meanings appropriate to the dominant discourses. So if you read Ashley's works, you'll find how this anarchy problematic has been discussed in detail. Similarly, there is also this concept of sovereignty, how sovereignty has been deconstructed by these scholars. Postmodernists argue that the paradigm of sovereignty has virtually deprived or denied our political imagination, the power of our imagination. And it has actually curtailed our understanding of the dynamics of international relations. The paradigm of sovereignty, how it has been interpreted in the conventional classical text like that. Scholars like David Campbell, R.B.J. Walker, and others raise this question very seriously. I mean, with regard to the question of sovereignty. So they said the question of sovereignty cannot be approached without ethico-political positioning. Sovereignty is a constituted political practice. It's not a kind of a given reality in that sense. Walker, for example, suggests that it is becoming increasingly difficult to organize modern political life in terms of sovereign states and sovereign boundaries. Campbell is interested in that sense in democratic pluralization, and that encompasses, includes two major important factors like tolerance and multiculturalism. Tolerance and multiculturalism within and across state boundaries, as against any totalization or universalization of concept of boundary and sovereignty. So boundary and sovereignty, these two concepts are deconstructed by scholars like Walker, Ashley, Derrida, Campbell, and others. Boundary is problematized by all these scholars by emphasizing new ways of understanding international relations with a kind of an ethico-political position. So postmodern IR scholars, they try to reimagine the world beyond the boundaries of mainstream IR text. So the academic implications of the postmodern, post-structural writings in IR, they are manifest in the quest for new inquiries and new sites of inquiries. And for them, power has an entirely different set of meanings today, going beyond national or state power and like that. Its subtle operations and constitution of realities is very important beyond the traditional micro-macro distinction. And that has attracted many scholars over for a period of time. And that's why that a number of scholars have moved beyond the traditional state-to-state relations or diplomatic relations as the domain of IR. And for them, questions of identity, questions of language, migration, diaspora, ethnicity, these are all important domains of inquiry now in the postmodern, post-structural writings and like that. They are no longer obsessed with the traditional security of nation states and like that. Rather, they will be more interested in the security of an individual and like that. So you have a kind of a new shift of emphasis from the macro level actors like state, international agencies to a level of non-state actors, a kind of micro level agencies and so on and so forth. And we have discussed how this postmodern explorations in IR, have been discussed, I mean criticized by a number of scholars from David Harvey to Samir Rabin and several others, Alexei Kalinowski and several others. Um, Alexei Kalinov and Richard, what we call as Frederick James, and several others criticized postmodernism as a kind of a cultural logic of the emerging forms of capitalism, late capitalism, and so on and so forth. The way it has been. The interesting thing is that many of these scholars have been critical of both capitalism and Marxism or any kind of totalizing ideologies and practices in that sense. Their basic approach is questioning these totalization strategies of the traditions that we inherited from the Enlightenment period onwards and like that. So that's why that they have an inherent hatred or kind of skepticism on issues of positivism, all scientific claims of truth, rationality, objectivity, and like that. They don't approve of this sort of question of objectivity and like that. The most comfortable, perhaps the least comfortable, say that the least that they could prefer could be the intersubjectivity rather than objectivity. So instead of the positivist notion of a methodological individualism, they would prefer a methodological pluralism, contesting all grand narratives, meta narratives, and all universalizing, hegemonizing tendencies and principles of modern politics and practices. All sorts of macro political identities they contested, and they actually favored political identities at the micro levels. That's why that they'd be more comfortable with mini narratives, local initiatives, local knowledge, local traditions. No claims of universality, truth. Rather than truth, they would be more comfortable in using this word, regimes of truth, or stability, order, rationality. These traditional concepts in IR have been contested by postmodern scholars from that point of view. So the reason is that they see modernity and all its claims as essentially elitist, hegemonic, oppressive, excluding, marginalizing many identities and so on and so forth. So in that sense, they would be more comfortable in using this project of in this project of emancipation rather than liberation or revolution from a macro level identity. They would be very happy if we have diverse positions and like that. That's why that many new social movements, protagonists of civil society, they are comfortable in engaging postmodernism and poststructuralism in that way of what we call as the claims and the grand schemes of the world like that. Development is one important scheme in that sense. Modernity is development strategies and like that. Postmodernists will be very critical of this the globalizing tendencies or hegemonizing tendencies development like that. They would say that we have more and more sides of inequality because of the kind of disruptions caused by grand level or mega projects or mega development schemes and things like that. That's why that they promote alternative movements and grassroots movements and like that. A major criticism from the conventional or the traditional Marxist or liberal scholars is that they try to deny the achievements of modernity and so forth, and therefore they deny the role of working class. They deny the role of the planning and other things and like that. Postmodernists say that they are not against any planning like that. Why don't you plan on a what do you call, on a very grand a scheme of micro level development rather than a scheme. No, they don't actually use this word grand or something like that. A kind of a micro level planning process rather than a kind of grand level planning like that. So this is a point where you have kind of doubt whether postmodernism is also encouraging a neoliberal scheme of things, because neoliberalism is also promoting decentralization, local level development like that. That smoothens the penetration of global capital at the minute centers of power and like that. Whether it is again a process of facilitating global capital uh, for its deep penetration into society and so on and so forth and like that, and also as a scheme of depoliticizing the use of words like a social capital and non-political project of development and like that. Like for example, the World Bank and several agencies promote like that. You have heard about the critiques of this social capital and neoliberal development, like John Harris and many others have written extensively on this like that. And for example, Samir Amin and others, Samir Amin who died last year, he also critiqued postmodernism and other things as a kind of as a strategy to rationalize this what we call as schemes of ethnicity, schemes of fundamentalism, schemes of all kinds of identity politics in that sense. His concerns are with respect to whether these totally decentered sites will uh, uh, weaken the movements and revolutionary potential of masses and like that. I think his critique of postmodernism could be available in many of his writings, including his Capitalism in the Age of Globalization. Like that. So I'm trying to wind up this the third discussion on postmodernism and IR with a kind of request that postmodernism is not is a kind of is not something to be celebrated, but is to be studied and explore the possibilities kept open by postmodern scholars of IR. It provided a kind of a broad platform for critiquing the mainstream IR scholarship from the point of view of its implications for regions, implications for local level realities of what the grand schemes like states, ideology, nationalism, etc., has been promoting all these years. Thank you very much for your patient listening.